So, is the microphone on? Yes.
Yes.
Welcome to this Filmmakers Live Talk. My name is Patrick Heidmann. I'm a journalist and critic, and I have the great pleasure to talk with Mary Harron today, whose film DALÍLAND is in the festival, obviously. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And for my first question, I want to actually gap the bridge to your very first film. Because in DALÍLAND, we have a world-famous artist in New York City. With I Shot Andy Warhol, there was also a world-famous artist in New York City. Do you see a similarity between the films? Is there some connective tissue?
I mean, Warhol learned everything from Salvador Dali about how to present himself and how to create an image, you know, a public image that would be instantly recognizable. I think Warhol kind of studied Dali. Dali was the first kind of, in some ways, the celebrity artist, the first artist to be on the cover of Time magazine. You know, he also, like Warhol, he did commercial things. You know, he would design furniture. He would do ads for Lanvin chocolates. You know, and which was very shocking in the fine art world. But they bridged the worlds of fine art and popular art, I think. And of course, they knew each other. And Andy Warhol said something very interesting about Salvador Dali. He said he's kind of more in the past than any of us, and he's more in the future. And to me, that's one of the most important things about Dali. I guess when I did the first film, though, I really wanted to make a film about Valerie Solanas.
Of course, yeah.
You know,
it wasn't about Warhol.
No, I mean that provided, in a way, it was an unexpected way in. And I think it's very difficult. Occasionally, it works to make a film with the artist absolutely at the center. One of the things is that the artistic process is really difficult to put on film. The only one I can think of that really managed it was At Eternity's Gate, the film, Julian Schnabel's film about Vincent van Gogh, because he's a painter and he had a way of kind of putting the painter on camera. I mean, there's Mike Lee, Mr. Turner, I like that one too. But I think painting itself is not dramatic, and the artistic process is not. The process of getting an idea and developing your artistic vision is very difficult to dramatize.
Yeah.
So you have to have another way in.
With Dali, I mean, he's lived such a long and rich life. There are thousands of stories that one could tell in a film. Your husband wrote the screenplay for this. How did the two of you decide on that period?
That was what was brought to us. There were actually 3 other scripts, and originally they just wanted us to rewrite them, and it was really a film about art fraud in the 70s, and the signing the pieces of paper, and they were actually very anti-Dali, these scripts, and they were very anti-Gala. And it's like, why these writers don't like these people? And we actually loved them, Dali and Gala, and we felt and John, my husband, came, and I was going to say no to the project, because I'd done Warhol, and I thought, I don't know if I want to revisit another film about a 20th century artist. And my husband said, it's a film about a marriage. And that was very interesting to me. And he said, Gala should be, rather than a kind of brief, she was kind of a peripheral character in these other scripts. He said, we'll make her a central character. It's about 2, you know, iconic people who've been married for 50 years, and they're both terrified of getting old. And it's very hard, and their relationship, which was so close for so many years, has kind of begun to fracture under their fear of death and their need to find distractions. Dali with his endless parties, and Gala by developing this kind of absurd infatuation for this young man. Yeah. Jesus, yeah.
You do like Gala a lot, right?
Oh, I love Gala.
But people hated her.
People hated her. It's very funny. We had a screening yesterday at the University of Film School, and a woman Barb was talking about Gala and how much people hated her, and a woman in the audience saying, no, that's all lies, that's not true. And she said, I knew Gala. Gala was wonderful. Gala was always kind to me. So it's like, wow. Yeah, well, that's, and you know, the way you got it all wrong. And, and then Barbara said, well, you know, Fassbender was always lovely to me. I know that other people could have a bad experience with, or sometimes he said that he was cruel to them, but he was always very kind to me. So your experience of an artist kind of depends on who you are and what your relationship is. Yeah. So some people love Gala. We found her, we wanted to, in some ways, not to whitewash her reputation, but to put her in the central place in his life and how dependent he was.
I'm going to come back to the wonderful Barbara Zukova in a minute, but I wanted to know, because the film, as it's set in the 70s in New York City, and you were there, I mean, you lived in New York in the 70s. How do you remember that time?
I remembered it as really kind of magical time. I'd left university. I was on my way to South America. I wanted to go and travel in South America and learn Spanish, and I had all these ideas. And I went to an English friend of mine. I went to university in England, and one of my friends was in New York, and he was having a 21st birthday party. So I was in Toronto, where I'm Canadian originally. And I took a train to New York for this birthday party, and it's like, I am never leaving this city. This is the greatest city in the world. And I never left. I mean, I went back and got all my stuff and put it in garbage bags, and I took it back on the train, and I moved to New York City. And it was a wonderful time. It was, at the time, everyone was saying New York was finished. It was a lot of crime, and they said it's dangerous and it's filthy. And it was the most exciting place I knew I'd ever been. And it was also, you know, and then by accident, I ended up stumbling upon the very early punk scene, like the very first punk scene in the world. You know, it was in this little club in the East Village, and I met this kid, Legs McNeil. I said, I want to be a writer. At that point, I thought I'd be a writer, a journalist. And he said, well, my friend's starting a magazine. I said, what's it called? He said, Punk. I said, oh, that's a great title. Wow, I love that. That's so funny. And so then we went to CBGB's that night, and we saw the Ramones, and that was my world for the next sort of 3 years, really. And then I moved back to Europe. And actually, I spent next 10 years trying to get back to New York, and I've lived in New York for the last 30 years. So, but to me, it was a very funny time. It was the 70s. It was very wide open. I think of it as kind of an innocent time. A lot of things that people think of as decadent, I remember as being kind of innocent and playful. And there was a lot of drugs, but I remember nobody thought cocaine was addictive or whatever. And, you know, you were sort of lucky if you could get it. And then there were, I think sexually it was, you know, post David Bowie, and it was a more open time of bisexuality or whatever. And it was just kind of experimental before a lot of sort of darkness came down. And I wanted to capture, some of the critics who write about the movie say, oh, it's this decadent, this awful world, and it's a world of vipers, and it's debauchery. And to me, I think it's just, I wanted it to seem fun.
I think it looks kind of fun, I have to say. I think, but probably for any film, casting is one of the most crucial things. It can ruin a film. I know you've in the past fought often for the right leading people. In this case, Sir Ben Kingsley as Dali, what makes him the perfect choice?
I think because initially I didn't see him sort of physically as Dali, and now when you see it, you think, oh, who else could play it? I also thought he was such a powerful presence. And Dali is kind of light in a way, and also kind of cowardly and a hypochondriac and fearful. And I thought of him, Sexy Beast made a huge impression on me. It's such a genius performance. I thought, oh, but he's so strong. And then this is an absurd story, but my husband and I, we were watching Iron Man 3. and in that film, he plays, I hate to spoil the plot of Iron Man 3, but he's playing both a terrorist and the actor who's pretending to be the terrorist. And this actor is a complete, sort of coward and is very funny. And I realized, oh my goodness, the range of this man's abilities is endless. There's almost like nothing, I think, that Ben Kingsley couldn't play.
No, probably right, yeah.
And also, he wasn't scared of doing, but I think, so there was that, like, can he do, like, comedy? But having someone to play genius, to play someone of that, stature is very difficult. They have to, they have to have a certain reserves of power and also a sense of mystery. Like, you would believe that he would come up with these ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's fantastic, and he was also very loyal to the project, wasn't he? Because
Very
it took
loyal.
a long time to make this film.
Very loyal. He had to, I had to do it. I did this Netflix series, and everything got put on hold. He had to do a TV series that got put on hold. Something else happened. Then he had a commitment. Then it was the pandemic, and he never wavered in his commitment. He really wanted to do. He told his agent, and also it was years of us trying to put the money together. Mm-hmm. And he said, it doesn't matter how long it takes for them to find the money, I will do it, which is great. Yeah.
And at what point did the wonderful Barbara Zukova come into play, who was honored here? Because she's not the most obvious choice on paper, is she?
Well, originally, because it was a British production, we actually shot in Liverpool, which is a whole other story, but it was a British production, a lot of British financing. I was going to cast Leslie Manville, who's a great actress too, and she would have been great, but very different. And Leslie, by the time we were able to film, she had a commitment and she just couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. So I really had to sit down and think, I thought, I'm not going to try anybody British. I really should be European. She's Russian, but I'm not familiar with Russian actresses. I looked in France, nobody seemed quite right. And I thought, who worked with Fassbinder? Of those actresses who would have that, because I love in Fassbinder, he loves the kind of diva. And these women who are very powerful, and they can be also good, bad, just powerful women. And I thought, oh, Barbara Sokovan, she's, she was the youngest of his stars, and she's still, working a lot, and she lives in Brooklyn, which is amazing. She lives in New York. That was incredible. So we just offered it to her.
Yeah. But since you mentioned Fassbinder, is he a filmmaker that inspired you in any way, or do you like his work?
I love Fassbinder, yes. I remember when I first went to see one, when I was young in New York, when I was like 22, someone took me on a date to see a Fassbinder movie, and I really hated it. And I was like, why did you take me to see this horrible movie? And like a lot of things I liked, I walked out of David Lynch's Eraserhead. I didn't like Cronenberg when I first, these three directors are very important to me. And I love Fassbinder now, and I'm endlessly inspired by him, actually, because for his, courage, but also that he somehow he can take elements of melodrama, but he's never sentimental, and he's always real. Mm-hmm. There's something that is always authentic, even when he's very stylized. Even when you look, we were watching Lola, bits of Lola the other night that Barbara's so wonderful in, and some of the lighting's very non-naturalistic. It's very extreme, and yet everything feels real. It's a magic that I can't quite unlock in Fassbinder's world.
Yeah. One question about the script, because we experienced this story through the eyes of this young, innocent man. Was that always the angle that you and your husband were going for, or did you experiment with the, perspectives?
No, I think we. In some ways, I wanted, to frame it of somebody being young in New York, and I think part of what I remembered about being young is everything seeming so wonderful at first, and people being so impressed by famous people, and then slowly you sort of begin to find out more about them, or you experience them more, and sometimes they're not nice to you, or just that there's an education that happens where you come out of it kind of older and wiser, but not necessarily rejecting it, but understanding more the complexity of people. So I wanted that framing. Now I wonder, could we have done it? It's very difficult. I feel like with characters as extreme as Dali and Gala, and much as people probably want more of them in the film, if you made the whole film about them, I think it would kind of blow the film apart. And also mainly at this time, all they were doing was fighting. Yeah. what there was, which I'm sorry we don't have, is there were 2 other flashbacks that I just couldn't afford to do.
Okay, so you didn't even shoot them.
We couldn't even shoot them. There was one I'm very sorry we didn't do, which was on the boat of young Dali and Gala arriving on the boat in New York, which I was going to shoot like a 1940s movie with, fog and the boat arriving. It would have been great, and it would have really been a good scene. But it's come to the point where I can't do it. And there was another scene of James and Dali walking in Central Park. We had to cut that at the last minute. It's very painful, some of these. And then originally, in my sort of dream script, I asked John to do a whole scene. Dali had an installation in the 1939 World's Fair, and you would have walked through this and it was so expensive. You would have had tanks with mermaids and these surreal images of installation. But I thought, that's great, because in a way that would be walking through surrealism. And we just couldn't do it. So you're left, there's the film you write, there's the film you make, there's the film you edit. They change each time you make it.
Yeah. And it's never easy. It definitely hasn't been easy for you, I think, in your career to make films.
No.
And probably it's never been easy to make independent films in the first place. But would you say, is it even more difficult today to make the films that you want to make? Or was it more difficult in the 90s?
No, I think it's more difficult now. I don't think it was ever easy. I have to say, one thing that I've never found easy is every time I make a film, like after I made my first film, and with I Shot Andy Warhol with Lily Taylor and Jared Harris, the first big part for Jared Harris, who's now very celebrated. And I thought, well, everyone said how great the casting was, so they'll let me cast who I want in the next one. And there was a huge battle that they didn't want me to cast Christian Bale. I got fired off the movie because they wanted Leonardo DiCaprio, and then finally they brought me back and Christian back. But the same thing happened on the next film and the next one. And I've never done a film where I didn't have a battle over casting. It's kind of amazing, but there you go.
And since you mentioned these 2 films, I mean, both I Shot Andy Warhol and American Psycho, they were quite acclaimed. They were not maybe huge hits, and there were people who didn't like them, but you got a lot of attention for them.
Yeah.
Would you agree that if a man had directed these 2 films, he would have gotten tons and tons of opportunities after that?
Oh, yes, I think so. I mean, I think if a man had directed American Psycho, he'd be given big studio pictures. And I was surprised. I was 9 months pregnant at the premiere of American Psycho, so I wasn't like chasing work in the year following it, but it's not like huge offers were coming in, actually. No. It's always sort of surprising to me. And especially as that film, I think it's helped me because that film continues, in some ways is more successful now than it was when it was released. But also I did a Netflix series that was very successful, Alias Grace, that had, great reviews. And I thought, I don't know why. It's just for whatever reason. But you can't dwell on it. You can't sort of feel sorry for yourself.
Yeah. We can talk about the Netflix show in a little bit.
Yeah.
Because that's also one of the exceptions where you don't maybe have an quote-unquote awful character in the center of it. You often tell stories of people who are very complicated, notorious, sometimes proper assholes. Is that something that you feel drawn to? Are you looking to divide the audience, or does it come with the territory? I
don't know. I mean, Notorious Betty Page, I think she's a very sympathetic character.
That's true.
Yeah. But to be honest, I mean, I have a script now where the character's ambiguous. I mean, I think I never wanted to do a conventional heroine. I'm not saying I never would, but there was certainly a lot of criticism when I wanted to do the story of Valerie Solanas, because it's like so few films get made about women. Why would you make a film about someone so awful or so controversial or so crazy? But I also thought she was a genius, brilliant, like a prophet, like a sort of brilliant woman who was tragic and suffered from mental illness. And that made a much more complicated, interesting story to me.
Yeah.
So I like things where it's complicated and you're torn in different directions about the characters. I'm sure that makes them less popular in some ways, but you can only make the films about the things that inspire you.
Yeah. Although I would think these days with TV shows like Breaking Bad and Sopranos, I mean, they have introduced
the anti-hero.
characters, you know, that we love to hate.
Yes,
Anti-heroes.
yes. Or love against our better judgment. Yeah, and it's funny, but I don't think that's made my life any easier. I don't know why.
So we still are not good with moral ambiguity in Hollywood.
No, I mean, certainly in television, there came a point where every script that you got sent, I mean, TV script was even when it wasn't appropriate, was about people who were morally compromised. It's like, really? I think these are just pretty simple story. You know, you're just trying to make this character corrupt, you know. Yeah, but no, they've definitely embraced it, which is interesting. I think more in television than cinema, actually. Yeah.
And speaking of television, I mean, over the years, like so many other female filmmakers especially, you did episodes of great TV shows, 6 Feet Under, The L Word, all these things. But you never did more than one of any show.
Yeah.
And it took a while until Alias Grace, which is available on Netflix, and it's fantastic, that you did an entire show on your own, right? With Sarah Polley, who wrote it.
Yes. I don't know. I mean, probably I'm starting to wonder if I wasn't. I didn't really have the ideal character for a TV director, because I think you can't be too opinionated, and I try not to be difficult. But I just have my ideas of how things ought to be. And really, I think if you're going to and when I started in television, I did fine, because you just think, okay, my job is just to finish on time and not to have ideas, But eventually I was just like, but I want to try this way. So I think I didn't necessarily fit in. I've been involved in lots of pilots that haven't happened, which I think is something that is more personal. In some ways I think, I wish I'd had more of a career in TV, but I also don't think that, because it can derail you. Getting a film made is hard. You have to live with no money for a while, but television just takes a lot out of you. And I remember after doing my first TV show, well, that was great, and they offered me another one right away, and I was like, I can't just go and do a second one. I felt completely worn out by it. But I would still go and do it. I still talk to people about doing TV, and I'll go back into it, but I never wanted it to be my main career.
And what was it about Alias Grace that made you interested?
Well, I was being offered all 6 episodes. And in fact, I tried to persuade Sarah Polley, who I was friendly with. I said, let's just divide them. I'll do 3, you do 3. Also, I was scared of doing all 6. And she said, and she was very clear about it. And first I said, are you sure you don't want to do this yourself? You're a director, you could do this. And she had various reasons, why she didn't want to do it. And she said, no, one person has to do the whole thing. It has to be the same. And once we started breaking it down and scheduling it, and I realized she's absolutely right, because we didn't shoot in sequence, and it would have been really strange to jump back and forth between directors. But also, I think she had a very strong sensibility as a writer, and she had actually she has really great visual ideas, Sarah, and she'd written those visual ideas into the script. So. She still gets a lot of credit for the direction, I think, from what she wrote in her scripts.
Yeah. We've mentioned American Psycho, and obviously I think that's always the first film that comes up when people hear your name. Has that ever been frustrating to you, or what does the film mean to you today?
I don't know. I mean, I think you just, someone interviewed me in a podcast the other day, and they said, do you feel like the Rolling Stones having to play Satisfaction again, your big hit? And I say, yes, in some ways I do feel that. And I don't know that I have much to say about it anymore. On the other hand, I think if you make a film that hits the zeitgeist, you just have to say thank you to the world. That's really fortunate, because there's great directors who never had one film that hit in a popular way that way. So I can only be, and I think I think everything came together very well. I mean, it's an incredible performance by Christian.
Yeah, you made him a star.
Yeah, I made him a star, and he's brilliant in it, and he put everything into it. And it was great source material. And I had a great, brilliant production designer and all the rest. Great DP. It all came together, but the fact that the film means something to people is also outside of my control. I think the fact that Trump came into power, American Psycho seemed even more relevant post-Trump, actually. Yeah. So that's not my doing,
But just briefly talking about Christian, because I think you said elsewhere that he probably wouldn't have gotten the Batman part if it weren't for American Psycho.
I mean, I shouldn't really say that because you never know who will get a part, but he had been known for British or European films, for sort of indie films. He hadn't played really bad ever. He hadn't been scary, he hadn't been, just his whole demeanor. I do think that he showed a whole dimension of himself in American Psycho, and I don't know what he would have been offered, whether he would have been offered something that showed that range.
Yeah.
You know.
And I told you that the other day. I, for one, think I Shot Andy Warhol should get the same resurrection that American Psycho had, but it's not available anywhere. And you told me that you're working on it, but tell us a little bit about how difficult it is for a director to get actually hold of the rights of your own work.
Yes, I've been working on trying to get this movie back into circulation, into streaming for about at least 3 years, maybe 4 years. Me with my lawyer and my managers, you know, we've all been trying to, and finally track down the rights, because what happened with the films of that generation of independent cinema, maybe in Germany too, I don't know, is they were released by small companies that went bankrupt, that were taken over by other companies who then went bankrupt, who, in my case, was taken over by another company who went bankrupt. And so it was trying to track what happens to copyright. And finally, it turned out the rights had reverted to the very original people. And then where are the elements? You know, it was not shot on film. Where are the film cans? Where's the negative? Where's the sound? And finally, then we found everything, and then they said, yes, but what about the music licenses? Is the music cleared? Can the music be cleared for, you know, the next generation? And it was like, oh my God, we have to find those. And we asked the music supervisor, I don't have them. Do we ask the company? I don't know, they're in boxes in somebody's basement. Anyway, long story short, but you have to, no one cares, I say this to directors, no one cares as much as you. So you have to take charge of uncovering your own work. And I hope it's going to be on Criterion next year, which would be great.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Any other of your films that you think are underrated by the audiences or critics?
Yeah, actually, I feel like all of them, really. I mean, Charlie Says, I feel like is a really good movie, and I think that was, I think people were very disturbed by it. I mean, it was, you know, it's about the Manson girls, but I think it has great performances, you know. It's one of my favorites. It's fun, and then, you know, I think, but Betty Page has a reputation. I think that is still on streaming, and people watch it.
That's a great film.
Yeah, and people really like that. It didn't do well. It did not do well when it was first released, and then, but it's still around. I think because people were disappointed, they wanted it to be all sexy, and it's really a story of a woman's life. And then I did a film called The Moth Diaries that everybody hated when it was released, and I got terrible reviews for it. And I haven't been able to look at it. But then, since I've been doing this press tour, then people have been, it's come up, and people have talked to me about it. I realized, oh yeah, that had a whole cult following. And I realized that, and I have to look at it. It had a very difficult production experience where we didn't manage to shoot a lot of scenes. But it was supposed to be sold as a vampire movie, but it's really about young girls' friendship. And I think that's very obsessive, but not necessarily sexual. And I think there's very few films that deal with the obsessive nature of young girl friendship. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like sometimes, you know, when I look at films I like, and there's some of them that they're not necessarily completely successful films of the past, but if they have a few great scenes or if they're about something that's really interesting, I think that they survive.
Yeah.
You know.
I'm going to let you guys ask questions as well, but I've got one more before I open up to the audience, because you were mentioning your beginnings as a journalist.
Yeah.
And I know you come from a family that is very associated with the showbiz. I mean, your father was an actor, for example. At what point did you discover filmmaking and decide that that's what you want to do?
Well, it's funny because I was sort of, I lived in part of my childhood, a couple years of my childhood in Hollywood, and then it was very funny when I saw Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because I would go and spend summers with my dad. You know, spent a couple summers out in Hollywood, as well as living there when I was like 5 and 6. But then I would go and spend these summers, and my dad was doing these TV shows that were very like the ones. It was so funny to me that Leonardo DiCaprio was doing in that movie. My dad did all of those, you know, and they're talking about that's what, you know, he'd been a Broadway stage actor, but then he ended up doing this stuff. Then he went back to Canada and did a lot of other stuff that was successful. But I grew up in show business. My first stepmother was a Hollywood starlet who had been the star of Kubrick's first movie, Fear and Desire. And so I was aware of kind of like also of this sort of downfall of Hollywood, the underside, like some certain amount of broken dreams of Hollywood, and which always interests me in Los Angeles. But it was like not an unknown world at all. And when I was younger, I thought maybe I'll write movies, although I don't actually think I'm that great a screenwriter. But at that point, I thought, well, that would be the only. If I wasn't going to be an actress, that was the only way I would get into movies would be as a screenwriter, and I was interested in that idea. And then when I was a teenager, I started going to. Grew up my teenage years in England, in London. And I would go to the National Film Theatre, and I started going to all the old movies, and I would see Fritz Lang's M, or Buñuel's, you know, Los Olvidados, you know, I'd start seeing all these art movies. But at that point, I think I wanted to be a painter. I didn't want to be, it never occurred to me that I could direct.
Because
never.
There were no other female directors
no.
that you could look up to?
Leni Riefenstahl, you know, I mean, really, hardly anybody. I mean, there were, but I didn't know of them. And then I remember when I was young in New York thinking, maybe I should just take a film course, you know, and then that sort of idea went. And then in my late 20s, I started writing scripts with a friend. And then I really was trying to write screenplays. But I wasn't thinking about directing until my 30s.
Yeah. So I could go on forever, but if anyone has a question, just raise your hand, please. If not, I'll just keep asking.
Oh, there's the one. Hi.
Oh, wait, there's a microphone coming. 1 second.
There's so much material, visual material on the factory and all, but was it the same situation with these famous St. Regis parties and all this stuff? I mean, did you have like visual footage that you could draw on?
There's photos, but there's not in the same way, because the thing about Warhol is Warhol really had a film studio, and he was filming his life constantly, and he had like Billy Name, who was like the house photographer, so there was amazing amount of footage that you could use and incorporate. And with Dali, there's some great films. There's some stuff shot in catechese. At one point, in an earlier version of the script, we wanted to recreate some of his kind of, you know, him and Gala kind of doing a surreal film on the beach. But in terms of his life in the St. Regis, there wasn't that much documentation, just a few photos, really. So it had to be more like our knowledge, you know, collecting knowledge of the period. And then the production designer was young, but she had grown up in near Figueres, you know, near Catechese. So she was Catalan, and she had a very good sensibility for Dali. But we didn't have the same kind of resources that we did.
Some more questions? If not, maybe, speaking of research, I mean, how much, what did you do? And your husband, of course.
Oh, yeah, a lot. I mean, we did the research together. You know, when I was, after I stopped being a journalist, I got a job in television as a researcher. And actually, even when I was in the punk years in New York, I would do fact-checking for a history magazine. That was my job. Like, I could spend a few hours doing that, just checking stuff. So I had a lot of research experience, and for like 4 or 5 years trying to get to direct, while I was waiting to direct in London, I worked as this researcher on all kinds of documentaries, including one on Warhol, one on the Velvet Underground. So I knew a lot about that stuff. And so it's very comfortable for me to sort of immerse myself. And John, my husband, comes more from fiction writing, so he's great at kind of dialogue and creating scenes, but I kind of sort of spearheaded, well, let's, you know, and we all read these books, and then we went to Spain, and we talked to people who knew him, and we just kind of together immersed ourselves in the subject.
Yeah. You've worked with a lot of other screenwriters over the years. Is working with your husband something special?
Yeah, it's great. And I always work with people who are better at dialogue than me, but also I like his sense of, but we have the same sense of humor. That is that is the thing with all the people I've worked with closely, is they have the same sense of humor, and find the same things dramatic. We have a lot of the same taste. The only problem is that, you know, because we live together, we never separate out work and life, really. So we'll talk about things over breakfast, or, you know, we're driving in the car, we're going grocery shopping, and we'll talk about stuff. But in some ways, we feel that we get less done than if we didn't live together and we had to arrange, because if we arranged to meet to work, then, you know, when I meet Guinevere or, you know, Dan Minahan, who was co-wrote the first film, we just go and work, you know, you meet in a coffee shop, you work. And with us, it's all kind of blurry. Life and art, you know, it's all blur.
Yeah. You have, just raise your hands, by the way. Oh, yes, please.
You mentioned before that it took some time to get the money to make this DALÍLAND film. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about what was the main reason? Was the story difficult, or was it maybe this character, which we know is not very well, not very popular, or has never been, or was always labeled as the woman, the tough manager who was only a vida dollars, after the dollars?
Yeah. I don't know. I think. Honestly, in terms of financing, and it was also about cast, but at the same time, I mean, Ezra Miller, who has been in trouble recently, but he was in the film, but he was not playing. Originally, Ezra Miller was going to play the young James, and then he got to be too famous, but still stayed loyal. I mean, if I'd had a big star as James, like, and they wanted me to cast like this, get this person from the Hunger Games, or this person. And I just didn't find the right person who was a young star after Ezra couldn't do it. So I think that didn't help. It's very, very difficult to finance an independent film now. I think it's a particularly difficult time. A lot of the money's in streaming, you know. So I don't know. But I was surprised how very hard it was to raise the money. But that's true of all of them, really.
Did you talk to streamers about the film?
Yeah, we did. Amazon didn't want to do it, and Netflix didn't want to do it. So once Amazon and Netflix don't want to do it, then you really are, and that has its own problems too. I mean, I guess the advantage is that then you're very independent. But my producer, who actually died this summer, Ed Pressman, who was a legendary independent producer, just went round and round, and all these kind of pulling together all kinds of different financiers. And finally, sort of enough money came in and enough tax credits. But I mean, honestly, I have to say I'm very fortunate that I've kept making movies. For the directors of my generation, it has really been hard for everybody.
Yeah.
You know.
May I ask something following
Yeah,
to
sure,
that?
sure, of course.
Because it's always interesting. A lot of filmmakers have this situation. You have started to develop a project, and then money doesn't come in quite as quickly as you would wish. How do you manage to work or keep working in the project, stay with the mind in the project? Are you able to prepare a lot of stuff, or are you then saying, okay, I'm just going to put it aside and do other stuff and then get back to it as soon as I can see I can follow up with the work?
I mean, honestly, I always keep on working on things, you know, whether they're financed or not. It's funny, my husband and I, in lockdown, we wrote an adaptation of a book that we didn't have the rights for. It's like, someday it'll happen, you know. I just feel like it's important to keep working. And then I always have a couple projects at once. I mean, Guinevere Turner, who wrote American Psycho, we have a project that's been going for like 10 years that I really want to do. That's actually quite inexpensive to shoot. We're just trying to find the time. So I work on that, and then I, you know, was working on DALÍLAND for a long time. Then I went and shot Alias Grace, and then in 2019 I was offered there's a thing called Quibi that like went bust. Oh, yeah. But they paid me a lot of money to shoot a sort of horror movie in installments. And I went off for 6 months and did that, and that paid for life during lockdown. But I would never do anything I didn't think was interesting, you know. But sometimes it's a genre thing that's interesting. So I go and do like a money job, and then I keep working on my other job. Yeah, because it's, otherwise I'm, it's, and if I didn't have anything, I would just work on something anyway, just to keep interested in things.
What needs to happen to a project for you to really let go and say, okay, this is never going to happen?
It's happened on several films. They were all involved with source material where someone wanted me and whoever I was working with to do it, and then they changed their mind. This happens with real life stories, actually. My husband and I wrote a whole movie set in Ireland, and then the woman whose story it was just said, I don't want this to be made. And then you're really stuck, because you try and persuade them, and if they say no, you have no story. This happened 3 times. I'm going to try and avoid doing real life. It's always dangerous doing the stories of people who are still alive, real life stories. So I've had this happen, yeah.
Must be really difficult.
It's very hard. Yeah, it's very hard, but you just have to keep going and go on to the next project. Yeah.
Any more questions? Because I was curious, since we spoke about being a female, I mean, it's always so silly to say female filmmaker because you're just a filmmaker. But we all know the situation is different for men and women in Hollywood. And you said somewhere that women who make films are never get called a genius. That's always something that happens to men. But you said it's an advantage, actually.
Yeah. I think in a way, being somewhat underrated is a good thing, because it makes you a little more self-critical, and you get less inflated about yourself. I mean, I think everyone gets a little inflated about themselves when they have their first movie, and you look back and think, oh, I was being such an idiot, I thought I was so great, and it's better to have, a little humility is not a bad thing, and then if people are less flattering to you or less, that's okay, not the worst thing.
Do you already know what's the next thing that actually is going to happen?
No, not really. I mean, also, I have 2 projects. One is a big project, one is a small project. If the big project gets delayed for a year because of availability, then I'll do the small project.
Yeah.
And that's, I try and also, sometimes when I'm thinking about the future and how hard it is to get finance, then I remember I was reading a medieval poem to my daughter, and this sounds a funny thing to do, but my younger daughter is 23, and she was, we were on holiday, and I said, I want you to read this poem. I hear this poem, and I read it to her, and she said, we should make a film of that. Let's make a short film this summer. I was like, oh, that's so great. I was wanting her to be a filmmaker, but now she's saying, yeah, let's do it. We'll just go and film. We'll get a camera. We'll just film nature. And I was like, yeah, you can also have these projects that don't take any money, that are just creative. And I think I always think, well, I can do those kind of films.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was going to ask what your kids do, if you would encourage them to go into film biz.
Well, I do, and it's funny because I think both of them, my older daughter works in radio and podcasting and is very successful. And she always said, I don't want to be a tortured artist like you and Dad. I don't want to be all depressed when I get bad reviews, just sit on the couch and be depressed for 6 months. It's like, oh, I didn't know I was showing depression. And, but we all talk about, I feel like she has learned an enormous amount narratively, about writing and about story. And, I'm glad that she has found radio, because that's a young person, actually, funnily enough, a young person's medium right now.
Interesting, isn't it?
And then my younger daughter, she says, I don't want to be a filmmaker, but I do think she probably may well. But I don't want to push it. And I know, and I try and tell them, well, you've watched us, and you've watched us be very disappointed, and you've watched us over and over, get bad reviews, and then you come back. And what I want you to learn from that is the coming back. Not the bad experience of disappointment, which everybody has. Even the most famous people, people far more famous than me, carry their bad reviews in their hearts,
So you do read them?
Actually, I read, this time round, I read the initial round, the good and the bad, and I said, don't send me any of them now, because I know now what the take is. Especially if you do, I'd rather let the dust settle and then go back and read. Because I think when you do a film about a real life person, this happened a little bit with Warhol. It happened very much with Betty Page. It happened with Charles Manson and the Manson girls. People know the story, so they think they have an idea of the film that they want to see, as opposed to going in completely innocently into a fictional drama. So in a way, I have to let people get over their disappointment in whatever kind of film I've done, and then I'll see what they don't. And they all have their flaws. So I'm you know, at some point I'll look and see, yeah, I could have done this better, or that was misconceived. But I also think the initial disappointment is more about it not being the kind of film they were expecting. You know.
Is it not the same with famous bestsellers like American Psycho or Alias Grace? The expectations are probably as high, aren't they?
Yeah, I suppose that's true. I mean, American Psycho had lots of bad reviews.
Yeah.
It was rotten on Rotten Tomatoes for years. Yeah. Alias Grace had really great reviews. I always think, oh, that's because Sarah has some way of doing it that I don't have, you know. That was the only thing I've ever done that had like totally good reviews. But it's worth seeing. Alias Grace on Netflix.
Yes, please check it out.
Yeah, I'm really attached to that one.
Yeah. I just keep going if you don't have questions. But because, I mean, we've talked about how hard it is to make films. Was there ever a moment where you thought, you know what, I give up, I do something different, it's frustrating?
No, because, well, it does, of course. My husband also feels that, and I say, yes, but if we didn't do this, we'd have to have real jobs. You know? And I've had real jobs, lots of real jobs. They're not fun. And I think, however, I mean, some of them are, obviously, people have wonderful jobs out there in the real world, but one of the things that you have to say is that it's very, very I worked in television for years. You know, it's very fortunate to have the amount of control over your work that you do as a director. It's a really privileged position. You know, Mark Twain said, you know, about writing, he says, you know, this is not work. This is a privilege.
Yeah.
I'm with Mark Twain on that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. So
people in Munich are shy. Yes.
Yes.
Hi. So you said that New York City for you was the most amazing city in the world, you said, and I was to ask, do you think that's regarding normal life or regarding more the show business, the film industry? So would you say like the life there helped you a lot in your career? Does it really offer lots of opportunities there or more than in other places, or how is it there?
I mean, not normally in New York because it's not a film center. It's not like an industry town like Los Angeles. And normally people would say if you want to make movies, you'd go to Los Angeles. I moved back to New York in 1991, 92. I was very lucky. I got a job on a TV show for a few months in New York. But I had intended to move back because I knew I couldn't write the story of Valerie Solanas and this film that I wanted to do. I had to be in New York to do all the research. But I was very fortunate. By the time I had the script, we went like in 93 or 94, it happened to be completely coincidentally the beginnings of independent film. And a friend of mine said, who I'd known for years, said, "Oh, you're doing want to do this film about Valerie Solanas. You should meet Christine Vachon, who is became a very famous independent producer, and she works with Todd Haynes and all these people, and she was very intrigued. She and her partner Tom Kalin were very intrigued by this idea of all the things that other people objected to in the story of Valerie Solanas, that she was an assassin, that she was crazy, that she was, you know, so controversial. They loved. And I walked out of this meeting like, I can't believe I've just, and we didn't have the money, but they said, you know, we'll make it, and Christine said, you know, we fit the style of our films to suit the budget. So whatever money we raise, that's the film we make. So it was like very punk, actually. Do it yourself. And to me, it just suited me down to the ground. I feel like there's been two very lucky moments in my life in New York. One was when I was young after college and found this sort of punk scene, and the other one was, no problem. I am always doing this. Usually it's me who's found this ring. And the other one was in the early 90s, to have just coincided with the beginnings of independent film, when I had a film, or was trying to write and make a film that fit that sort of ethos. And really, when I think about how fortunate both those things were, I can't really complain about anything in my career because I've been so fortunate.
Yeah. That's wonderful to hear. I think there was here in the first row.
I would have a question about what if you think about directors' responsibility regarding showing violence in movies. I don't know. For my personally, like I mean, I've heard I know that Quentin Tarantino, for example, is often being criticized for violence. And do you have any director's responsibility? I know myself that American Psycho, when I grew up, kind of people going crazy about it and putting posters in their room, and then I don't know exactly what my question is, but it's almost like there are always some people that are more aware, they understand the movie and they know what it really is about, I guess, and some people watch it and they maybe don't get the movie and think it's, oh, Patrick Heidmann is so cool, I'm gonna dress up like him.
I know. Well, that to me is amazing because, you're right, of course, that's absolutely true that people do. And the movie is very popular in Wall Street. And Guinevere and I are like, really? Do you not know this is making fun of you? Do you not see that this is a satire and this guy's a complete jerk? And Christian, one of the reasons why I loved Christian and wanted to cast him in the role was that he saw the character as so uncool. And in fact, he plays him as very dorky, very absurd, very embarrassing, awkward, really. And that somehow there's, partly because the style of it is kind of, it has this sort of sheen or whatever, his apartment, people think that he's cool. I'm just always stunned by this. But I think one of the things is you cannot predict how a film of yours will affect people. You just have no control over it. And the people who, in terms of people who've been serial killers, the big book for assassins or these lone killers is Catcher in the Rye, that's not a violent book, but it's about this sort of misunderstood tragic loner, I think, there is violence in the society. These things exist, and you could not cover it. But I think I try and do the violence in a non-voyeuristic way. Actually, I mean, the one thing that I did do in American Psycho was, in the book, the victims tend to be kind of faceless, and I wanted the character, the prostitute Christie, the perspective of the film shifts. So it shifts in those scenes, the two big scenes with her, shifts from his perspective to her perspective, so that you're very aware. Because I thought I want people to know that this is a human being being killed, a vulnerable human being, and I think that's all you can do, because to not cover violence is then not to cover the world, That's all I would say. It's not something you do lightly, There's definitely violence in my next couple of projects, but,
Yeah, I think we can all not wait for the next couple of projects. I hope you'll bring them back to Munich.
I hope so.
And I thank you very much for this time with us and for being here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for such a nice time. Betty Page. Is this still on? Yeah, and it was my favorite moment ever in a film festival because someone stood up in the audience in Berlin and said, "Why is your film so bad?" And then someone else, and I thought that was hilarious. And then I said, "I don't know, film's a film." And then someone else shouted at them, and there was a big fight in the audience. But in Munich, it's been very, very pleasant. So thank you all.